Hello, John. Nice to see you. Do you see me?
Oh, good to see you here. Let me put you on a bigger screen here. Now, are you in Prague or are you somewhere else?
I'm in Helsinki, Finland.
Yeah, yeah. I read, when I was looking up your name or something, I realized you're Finnish, and yet here you are doing this Prague festival and everything. So, but you live and you work in Helsinki.
I also live in Helsinki and in Prague.
Oh, okay.
A lot of things connect me to the city, and I love it a lot.
Oh, okay, okay, great.
And with
I
this
see paintings
festival,
on the. Are those your paintings on the wall back there?
no, these paintings are my mother's.
Oh, okay,
An
nice.
artist.
Oh, good. Okay, nice. Yeah, very nice.
We're very excited to present your film, I'm Hip, at the Prague Independent Film Festival. It is a wonderful picture with an amazing cat.
Yeah, it's a, it was a very silly movie. I worked for Disney for 40 years and worked on these big feature films, but I always wanted to make a short film. I went to Cal Arts for 2 years and I studied animation there. I was part of their first character animation class. My classmates were John Lasseter and Tim Burton was there when I was there, and Brad Bird, who did The Incredibles, and so we made our little short tests, almost not even films, back when I was at CalArts. And I always wanted to, during all the years I was at Disney, make my own short film again. I started as an animator, and I've always continued to draw, but I haven't really animated. I had kind of a, I was started at Disney as an animator, and then I kind of took 35 years off from being an animator, and then got back to it in this short film. I really wanted to animate again, so it was fun for me to do something very light. It's a based on this song "I'm Hip" that I had heard 30 years ago, literally, and I always thought, oh, that would be fun to animate to. And I always had in the back of my head that it'd be fun to do a film with that. So when I retired from Disney, I looked into getting the rights to that song, and I got the rights, and I storyboarded it. And my intention was to do all the animation myself, and I did. I did all the character animation myself in the film, and I thought it might take me 2 years to do it, and it took me 4 years. I was much slower than I'm supposed to be, but so I just, and I didn't work full time at doing it. I did it, and I had fun doing other things, and then finally I completed it last year, and it premiered sort of at Annecy last year, and then I've been playing it at different festivals, and I'm very happy that it will be at the Prague Festival coming up very shortly.
Yes, we were very happy to see this film, and we immediately saw that it is a wonderful movie. But then we saw who made it, also a legendary director. So
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed, like I say, I started as an animator, so and in the film, I dedicate the film to Eric Larson, among other things. Eric Larson was my teacher of animation at the Disney studio. He was one of the legendary nine old men who he worked on, Snow White, and Pinocchio. He did, Figaro the cat in Pinocchio, and Cleo the fish, and he did many other characters. And then in the 70s, he was put in charge of training young animators at Disney. When I first came to Disney in 1977, I got to work with Eric, and he was the one who really taught me animation. Even though I'd gone to Cal Arts for 2 years, Eric was the real teacher of animation for me. So I wanted to dedicate this film to him. He died a few years ago because he was a mentor not just to me but to a whole generation. So yes, I've done these big, elaborate multi-year projects, with hundreds of artists, and then I did this one with a handful of people. Of course, I thought because it's just me doing it, it'll go much quicker. It won't be quite like this big ocean liner that these features are. So to do a movie like, you know, say whatever, Princess and the Frog or Moana, it took like 4 years to make those movies. And so I thought, I'll do mine. And so instead of doing, 80 minutes in 4 years, I did my 4 minutes in 4 years. So I didn't go any faster. I was just as it was as laborious as ever. But yes, I have this strange career in that I did these sort of big films with Ron Clements, where we wrote and directed a lot of these big movies. But then uh, I'm I enjoyed doing this little film, and I've got a few others in my head that I would also like to do, that I'm in the planning stages of, and I'm hoping that I'm going to animate a few more of these kind of little ones that are kind of personal projects for me and just fun to do. And I'm this little cottage, here I am in my studio working away, and it's a fun thing. And then yet I still collaborate with people, because my favorite part of working in a big studio was the collaboration with other artists. They always enriched the movies. There's a lot of ideas that came from other people. And so even on this one, I had some great help from visual development people and background artists and cleanup artists and my sound effects editor and things like that. So I was still directing on a smaller scale, some of these other people.
And do you have any pets?
Do I have any pets? Well, it's weird. I am Irish American. My grandparents came from Ireland, and they brought with them all their allergies. So my mother had terrible allergies. So when I grew up, I inherited them from my mother. So we never had any pets around or anything like that. So we it is funny though, because there's a Disney Family Museum up in the Presidio up in San Francisco, and it was built by Diane Disney, Walt Disney's daughter, and it celebrates Walt Disney the man. But they have various art shows there, and they were having a show of paintings of pets by various animators, and they asked me if I would like to participate. I said, well, I have allergies. I never had any pets. And they said, well, you can draw your cat from your movie. So I did. So I drew a picture of my cat, and I wanted to make it kind of jokey. So I did this little drawing of my cat, but I did it like the Sistine Chapel. So I have me as God, and the cat is like Adam, and we're touching fingers, as Michelangelo did. And so I sent it to them, and they said, okay, fine, we'll print it up and put it in the show. But what I didn't realize is they printed it up so it was wall size. It was like 15 feet by 10 feet high, and they put it up at the entrance to this exhibit that they were doing of all, people drew their dog or their cat in these nice little paintings, and I have this big thing of this stupid cartoony cat. But yes, I don't. My daughter, who has some allergies, has a pet dog. It's a golden doodle, and she brings it over all the time. And she's not so allergic to it. And its name is Potato. She calls it Tato. So Tato was just here yesterday, and Tato's a wonderful dog. And we did have a cat that sort of adopted us years ago, wandered in the backyard, this kind of feral cat, and hung around. And so it became kind of our pet, even though all of us were, or my wife wasn't allergic to it, but all of my kids and I am allergic to these pets. So anyway, do you have a pet? I don't see
No,
anybody.
I don't have any pets. I just
Okay.
expected some cats to model for the film.
Yeah, I know. Yes, I know. I have friends who have cats. There's some big cat fanciers, and my sister-in-law is a cat. They did a little modeling for me, but the rest of it, I somewhat invented.
Okay, and what artist inspired you when making the film?
One of the big artists that inspired me, and named David Stone Martin. He designed a bunch of jazz record albums in the early 60s. And he did one after another. And they're these beautiful designs of very linear drawings, beautiful black and white sort of pen illustrations, and then flat planes of color behind those. They don't conform to the lines of the drawings, but he was very much in vogue in the 60s. So a lot of these great jazz album covers have his kind of flat pattern thing. So I wanted in this film to adapt his style. So we have this kind of linear style with flat planes of color behind it that don't always conform to those lines. In fact, even the cat, sometimes, we let the color of the cat extend beyond the lines. And in the backgrounds, there's a linear drawing, but there's things that go beyond that. That was one of the inspirations. Certainly another one of Disney's now men was Ward Kimball, the great animator Ward Kimball, who he animated Jiminy Cricket and Pinocchio, but then on Alice in Wonderland, he did the Mad Tea Party sequence. And he was always, in some ways, the cartooniest of all the veteran Disney animators. And I got to study with him briefly when I was at the studio in the 70s. But he did the Cheshire Cat and Alice in Wonderland, and he did Tweedledum and Tweedledee. But he was a very musical. He was the most musical of the 9 old men. So he was an influence on the film. Now, on this film, I have actually embedded. I'm a caricaturist, and so for all these years at the studio, I have done caricatures of my fellow workers. I do them with my family members. Every year I draw a Christmas card that has my caricatures of my family, and it's some topical thing of what's happened in the last year or whatever. So in this film, I had these scenes where I had, in effect, extras. The cat would be wandering down a busy city street, and I had to put people in the street. So I thought, well, I'm going to put people I know in there, or that I'm kind of doing an homage to. So, for example, on that big city street at the beginning where they're walking down, Ward Kimball is walking down the street. He's carrying a trombone because he was a musician, and that was his instrument. But I also put on that street in the lower right corner, two of the people I worked with on Moana. I have caricatures of Taika Waititi and Lin-Manuel Miranda, who did Hamilton. They both did, were writers both of the script and of music on Moana. So I stuck them down there. But then I have my wife and I are in the shot, and my son's partner is in the shot, and I scattered people throughout, including Eric Larson, my mentor from Disney. He's the fisherman who pulls the cat up out of the water. That actually is, and that was sort of a metaphor for Eric saving my neck. It's the studio a few times where they weren't happy with my work when I first started there. My animation was getting highly criticized, but Eric was my defender and said, no, he's good. Don't give him another chance. So there's over 120 of these caricatures that are embedded in the film. Again, people that no one would know, but my amusement in the scene when we're in the movie theater, when the cat's in the movie theater with his girlfriend watching the arty French film, which is sort of a parody of Jean-Luc Godard's Alphaville, is what they're watching on the screen. But in the audience there, the film buffs include Brad Bird and Henry Selick, who I went to Cal Arts with, and Jerry Reese, who directed Brave Little Toaster, and my sister and her husband, who's a film professor in Chicago, and Jennifer Yuen, my layout artist. Everyone in that shot is someone that I know, and I just had fun doing it. So when I premiered the film here in Los Angeles, I invited a bunch of people to a theater, and I made prints of those frames that the people appear in, and I gave them prints of their things so they could have a little piece of the film. So in a way, that film originally for me was meant to be kind of a sort of a Valentine to hand-drawn animation. That's what I grew up learning, and I love hand-drawn animation. So I wanted to celebrate full animation, animation that's on one sometimes, and isn't limited. It's fully animated. But I also wanted to celebrate jazz because I'm a fan of jazz. I play the piano very poorly, and I play a little bit of jazz. But then it became this Valentine to all my friends and family because I stuck them all in the movie. So when I had this premiere, it was like a big party where all these people I knew got to enjoy seeing themselves very briefly and for frames, literally in some cases, in this film. But it was fun for me just to make it this kind of hug to all these people.
So that's wonderful. And what technologies did you use when making the film?
I animated the whole thing by hand, but I did it on this thing that's over to my left here. I animated on a Cintiq, a pressure-sensitive tablet, and I was at first I wasn't sure if I was going to animate on paper or animate using software in one of these systems, and I thought I'm going to do a test. And there's an old American story that you're not probably familiar with, a legend called John Henry. John Henry was an African American man who was he drove rails, he laid tracks for trains, and the legend was who could do it faster, the machine or John Henry. And so John Henry was out there hammering away with a sledgehammer, and I think he defeated the machine. So I thought I'm going to take a scene and do it on paper, and I'm going to take another scene or maybe in the same scene and do it in the system on the Cintiq with the stylus and all that, and see which I like better. Well, I started to do some experiments just doing it by hand, and I was struggling because I couldn't get scans of my hand drawn, my drawings on paper were coming out kind of weird, and I didn't like the resolution, the way they looked. And then I heard about this program called TV Paint, which is a French program. I don't know if you're familiar with it or if you've ever used it or people have used it, but it's a great program. Even though it's called TV Paint, it doesn't have much to do with TV, but it's sort of like Photoshop. You work in layers, you draw in the system. I'm still drawing, but I'm drawing on a tablet. So I did it scene then. I said, well, let me try that. And I did it, and I love that technique. So I used that for the entire film. So all the backgrounds were painted like in Illustrator or Photoshop and imported. And then After Effects was used. I have this great girl, Talene Tanelian, who was my right-hand production person on this, and she composited everything in After Effects. So even though the backgrounds were, drawn traditionally, but they were drawn in Photoshop and then composited in After Effects, and then assembled in Adobe Premiere at the end of the line. Everything sort of moved into Adobe Premiere. And then I got for the sound mix, I asked the head mixer who did Moana and Princess and the Frog and Frozen and all these films at Disney if he wanted to mix my film, and he agreed to. So I rented the studio in Santa Monica, and he got a day off work, and I paid him, and he mixed the film there, and it was great having his expertise letting the sound effects to the track and all that. So yeah, so it was taking advantage of digital tools that I had, but the heart of it were still those animation lessons I learned from Eric Larson 45 years ago, which had to do with squash and stretch and communicating graphically, having strong silhouettes, having arcs that people can follow, having volumetric drawing and believable action that has weight. And so it was a celebration of that traditional thing, but using new tools.
Yes, I really loved it, and for me it was difficult to understand if it's traditionally just on paper drawn or.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't.
There were times where we even, because of the look of David Stone Martin's illustrations, he used watercolor in those washes. Uh, so Ken Slevin, who did some of the backgrounds, really uh, used digital tools that simulated watercolors to sort of give a kind of a splattered look to some of the backgrounds and a loose thing. And there was development art that was done by Claudio Acciari, great Italian artist, who did some watercolors for me and things like that. And in fact, he even scanned some of his watercolors, and we used some of the textures from his watercolor scans in some of the backgrounds because it just gave a neat hand-drawn sort of period look to it.
It's great that you embrace new technologies. And what it's like to make your first independent film?
Well, it was interesting because I enjoyed it, and the weird thing was I started before COVID happened. I started mapping out the film, and I would invite people here to my studio and show them the project. Do you want to work on this or not? And they said yes. I also produced the film myself. I didn't really want to have to answer to anybody. I had a lot of creative freedom at Disney, but I really felt that I didn't want to have to show it to anybody other than me to get approval for anything. So I paid for everything, and then I paid all the people who worked on my film. I didn't want to try and chisel free labor out of them, so I paid them, not as much as they would get paid in a big studio, but I did pay them. Um, but it was COVID made it a little weird in a way then, because I was retired and I was working in my studio, and then it seemed like when COVID happened, instead of me just being kind of cozy in my studio, the whole world retired. It felt like, everybody was retired. So the novelty wore off a little bit. I thought, no, I want to be the only one retired. I want the world to continue outside my room. And yet, people were cocooning and in their own spaces. It was interesting because I'm a fairly disorganized person. So I had to get more organized. At Disney, we had great teams of production people who really kept us on track, and how those films couldn't have been made without those people. But I had to become those people a little bit, and I had to create a bit of a schedule. I didn't want to burden myself too much with deadlines, and yet I had to kind of figure out, I got to do this in order to get this done, to get this done, and this done. So I was my own kind of production manager in some ways, and Talene was that. So that was a new thing for me, just trying to stay on track. And literally, every week when somebody would complete something, I would have to write out a check for them and send it out. So I was the payroll department, and I was all that. And that's nothing new to anybody in the world of independent film, but for me it was, who had this, was very spoiled by this great infrastructure that did so many things for me, and you could just focus on these other things. I had to wear many hats, but it was fun. I mean, I liked bouncing back and forth between these different roles, and so I enjoyed being an independent filmmaker, and I've enjoyed certainly going to some festivals, enjoying it, and seeing the work of other filmmakers all through the years. I've enjoyed independent films, both live action and animation. I'm a member of the Motion Picture Academy, so we see the films that are up every year, both for animation and live action. And there's some brilliant. I don't go to the huge live action screenings, but after they get whittled down to a smaller number of 15 or so, I see those, and I really am in awe of so many of them, and it's always a challenge. I know for any filmmaker, live action or animation, to pull together a team, to find a grant or find some money. It's it's a struggle in that world, and I get it, and I see that even more now that I'm paying the bills. But I really enjoyed it, and like I say, I would like to do another one. And I just like sort of veering off, the other ones I have in my head are again music driven, because that's what fascinates me most about animation, I guess, is the way it works to music. Although two of the things I'm considering are instrumental pieces, they have no lyrics. so the story can go in many different directions. So it's a little trickier for me to zero in on the story because you don't have the lyrics as kind of a framework. Um, but I like that too because I can, and with this one, the film I just did, if I really tried to work to the track, so I couldn't, lengthen the track, nor could I, there was certain story content that was dictated by the lyrics. Now with this other one, if I decide I want this shot to be longer, I can make it longer. I still have to eat into some other scene, but I'm not bumping into a lyric that doesn't make sense anymore. So I'm looking forward to that as a new challenge because I didn't really have to face that on the last film. Um, but I've enjoyed being an independent filmmaker. As
So
a you are an independent filmmaker,
yes,
yeah.
I'm also
And
independent.
and do you like being an independent filmmaker?
Very much actually, because I have a lot of my own ideas that not everyone understands, and
Right. Yeah,
so
exactly. I mean, I feel like it gives you, I'm still making, because of my own nature, I still make a film for an audience. Some people could make a film and say, I don't care if anybody understands it. If I like it, that's all that counts. And I'm just making it complete. I admire people who do that. I'm not like that. I'm still like I'm an entertainer. I'm a storyteller. I'm trying to communicate to an audience. If an audience looks at what I'm doing and they don't get it, I, I I'm disappointed because that wasn't the intention. However, I don't like having that middle area of people saying, do this or do that or don't. People may like this or they may not like that, and I enjoyed not having to go through that gauntlet. And I, like I say, in making another film, if I do make another film, which I hope to do, I will again enjoy that thing. And again, doing some things that I'm amused by that other people may not find amusing, or I'm moved by. There's some of these other ones have a little more emotion possibly in them and a little bit more drama. They're not all just comedy, 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 but uh, it it's fun to just go down some of these byways, that may be a little bit off the beaten path.
yes, that's so true. And how did you first start working at Disney? Was it Disney?
I Yeah, I'm from Chicago, Illinois originally. It's a city. Have you ever been to Chicago? It's
Oh,
in the
no.
middle of the United
I
States.
have never been to there to the
You never
United.
been to the United States at all? Oh, you should come. Uh, go to the Malibu, go to the beach, see the ocean. You've seen the ocean, a different ocean, yeah, you would do well here. So I always drew as a kid. I always did cartoons and things like that. So I thought I would probably go into that sort of line of work. Now I'm a Catholic and I went to Catholic schools. So I was taught by nuns in my youth. And then I went to an all guys Jesuit Catholic high school and they had no art classes there sort of. So again, I was sort of teaching myself to draw, reading comic books, seeing Disney films. I got hooked on animation at an early age and thought I might want to be an animator, but my interest drifted away from that a little bit. But some things happened and when I went to college, I went to Northwestern University in Evanston near Chicago, and I majored in English literature because the Jesuits had convinced me I shouldn't use college as a vocational school. So I thought, well, I'm going to major in English to force myself to read the great books of the world, including English literature, and in the meantime, continue to draw. And I'll probably try and get a job doing drawing, cartooning of some kind, either in comic books or whatever. So then, when I was at Northwestern, Chuck Jones came to speak there, the great Warner Brothers director who did the Roadrunner cartoons and Great Bugs and Daffy cartoons, and he showed a selection of his films, and they were amazing. And he spoke very passionately about animation, and said how he, as a 60-something-year-old guy at that point, still felt like he was learning things, and that really made an impact on me to feel like, hey, here's this guy in the 60s who's still learning things, that if I'm going to go into a career like that, you're not just repeating yourself, you're always learning. And then I heard Dick Williams speak, the great Canadian animator who had the studio in London, who had done a version of the Christmas Carol, the Dickens story for American television, half-hour special, done in the style of the Dickens illustrations. And that was beautifully done. And I went to a retrospective of his work, and he came and spoke at it in Chicago in the 70s. And again, totally passionate ambassador for hand-drawn animation. And people in the audience were raising their hand, can I come work for you and all this? And he's like, no, I've got enough people at the moment. But that made an impact on me. And then at the same time, Christopher Finch, a British author, wrote a book on the art of Walt Disney, a big coffee table book. And that, for one of the first times, said who did what. It identified artists. It talked about Ward Kimball, talked about Frank Thomas, who animated Bambi on the ice, or Milt Kahl, who did Shere Khan, or whomever, or Ken O'Connor, the great layout artist who I had as a teacher later at CalArts, who designed The Flight Over London and Peter Pan. Anyway, it seemed kind of cool to me that you could make these big films and yet be an individual and, and you did a certain thing. It isn't Walt Disney who's doing these things. There's artists that are doing these things. And in that book, they mentioned that Disney was starting a training program for young artists. What had happened was Jungle Book came out in 1967, and Walt Disney had died in 1966. Jungle Book was a big hit around the world, but they weren't sure what they were going to do at the animation department because all the animators were in their 60s, most of them. They hadn't brought in younger animators, so they were all near retirement age or dying. And so studio realized if they were going to keep us up, they had to bring in young talent. So they started this sort of talent program and talent search. So I heard about that. I sent them, they said they needed a portfolio of animal drawings and all that. And as I say, they wanted animal sketches and I have these allergies, so we had no animals. So I went to the zoo in Chicago and it was winter time when I was trying to do my portfolio and I was freezing, trying to draw the poor monkeys that were out there with me in the freezing cold, much like Finland. And then I couldn't stand it. So I realized, wait a minute, I can go to the Natural History Museum in Chicago that has all these dioramas of animals. And I'm in, very 70 degrees Fahrenheit surroundings. So I did drawings there. I thought they turned out okay. I sent them off to Disney. A few weeks later, I got my letter back, a rejection letter saying, we didn't, your portfolio, you don't draw well enough. And in particular, their one critique was that my animal drawings were too stiff. Too stiff. They were stuffed. These animals I was drawing were like that. I drew them exactly as I saw. Anyway, I sent a portfolio to Marvel Comics. I got rejected by them. But then a few weeks later, Disney sent me another letter, said, maybe you want to send your portfolio to CalArts. We're starting a character animation program that's like Disney style animation taught by Disney veterans. So even though I already had this English degree, I thought, well, maybe I will try this at CalArts. So I sent them a portfolio, got accepted, wound up going there 2 years. And while I was at CalArts, the Disney Review Board came and saw the student work at CalArts, and they saw my work. They didn't realize I was the same guy they had rejected before. So they liked my work now, and they asked me to come work for them. So I started work there in 1977, before you were born. It was the week that Star Wars came out in the United States here, and I started there in '77, and I wound up working there for about 41 years. So, and throughout that time, I had my ups and downs. There were times where our films were, it was hard to make them, or we had creative battles, or some didn't do that well at the box office, and we were in the doghouse at the studio. You guys don't know what you're doing, and we had to fight to make the next movie. But overall, it was a very fun ride. Great support, worked with great artists, and had a wonderful time doing it, and got to travel the world promoting these movies. We went to Scandinavia to promote Princess and the Frog and things like that. We had the journalists come from Finland and other places to Stockholm. I think we did it in Stockholm, and it was it was a fun ride. And now it's a fun traveling to some of these places. I really wish I could have gone to Prague. I still want to get to Prague at some point, and I'd like to go to Finland.
I hope that next time you come to Prague.
Next time I would like to come, and I would like to go to Finland at some point. Even I've never been. I know they're big on Donald Duck in Finland. I think he's big in Finland. But
yes, I always loved also Donald Duck, and in Finnish it's called Aku Anka.
Aku Anka? Okay. Okay, I'll have to check out the Finnish version. Yeah, so it's been a wonderful career, and I have 3 children. I have twin sons, and I have a daughter, and my sons are both in creative lines of work. My daughter doesn't draw either, but my one son works for an ad agency that does movie posters and trailers, and he kind of is an art director-y kind of guy there. And then my other son is a radio producer. He's produced and a podcast producer, and now he's written some young adult novels, which is cool. And then my daughter is a family therapist. I met my wife, and my daughter has a very good design sense, but she does therapy. And my wife I met at Disney. She was a librarian there. They had an in-house library, so I met her, right around when I started. And we're having our 45th wedding anniversary in a couple of weeks, and she retired from the library once we had kids, but she majored in English and drama, and she's very funny and been a great supporter of an inspiration. She's my muse and all these things, and so it's been a wonderful thing overall.
And can you tell something about my favorite movie, The Little Mermaid?
Yes. The Little Mermaid. When Eisner and Katzenberg came to Disney in the mid '80s from Paramount, they brought a system with them to develop new movies. They didn't know much about animation, but they had a thing at Paramount called the Gong Show, which is based on this American game show, where basically people would come to a table with Michael and Jeffrey and pitch ideas for possible films. And if they liked them, they might put them into development. A very brief pitch. If they didn't like them, they go gong, and you get yanked off stage. So Ron Clements, when this Gong Show was coming up in 1985, we were supposed to bring I think 3 ideas to the meeting. He went to a bookstore and he found a collection of fairy tales, and he found The Little Mermaid, which he had never read. And he stood in the bookstore and read the book, and he loved it. Although he got to the end, he's like, "Ooh, boy, it may take some work to make a sort of semi at least happy ending out of that." So he pitched The Little Mermaid at the Gong Show to Michael and Jeffrey. He wrote a 2-page treatment, and I was not involved at this point. I was pitching other ideas, and initially they said, Gong, nope, we don't want to do it, because they were working on a sequel to the movie Splash, which originally Brian Grazer and Ron Howard's movie was based in its own way on The Little Mermaid. It was sort of a version of The Little Mermaid. Anyway, so they said, no, we're doing the sequel, so forget it. But then they went away and read Ron's 2-page treatment, and Michael Eisner realized, well, wait a minute, Disney and fairy tales, this sounds like it could be good. Let's put it into development. So they put it into development, where it was there for a few months. And then they hired a live action writer, Michael Christopher, who wrote The Witches of Eastwick and directed that, to write a script on it. And he had a very dark vision, and he realized very quickly, I'm not the right guy for this. So Ron and I, who had written on Great Massachusetts, Ron came to me and said, would you like to write the script with me? Because we had written together on this earlier movie. And I said, yes, I would love to write the script. So he pitched it, let us write the script. So they did. They let us write the script. And we spent, about 12 weeks writing that script, or eight to 12 weeks. And then we gave it to them, and they really liked it. And they paired us up with Howard Ashman, the great Howard Ashman, who wrote The Little Shop of Horrors. He was the lyricist and really conceived of how music would work in that story. We met with him in New York City, and we showed him our outline, and he had ideas for how he thought the songs might advance the story. And so he was off busy directing a play in New York while we wrote the script. And then he started writing the music with Alan Menken. And so then he eventually came to California and lived like 3 weeks out of every month in California, had an office right next to ours. And the music was written the way the music was written for Snow White, where it was written in the same building, like right down the hall. There were musicians playing on the piano, and come on down the hall and hear this song here, Under the Sea, here it is. And we'd say, yes, that's great. Right? And Howard would be sitting on the piano and say, Alan, play that figure. No, not that one, the other one, and he'd be there hammering away at the piano. And so that's sort of how the songs were written. And we were storyboarding them literally a few doors down. And they were made, the movie was made under trying circumstances, though, because they had kicked us off the Disney lot in Burbank. There was a big, nice building that Walt Disney had built in 1940, where Snow White, well, actually, no, where the 40s films were done, and Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty and all those. But when Eisner and Katzenberg came in, they wanted that building for live action. So they kicked us off the lot and put us in a warehouse. And so Mermaid was basically kind of done in a warehouse in Glendale, not very picturesque and not near any water. And but we all get, it was sort of a sink or swim mentality, so to speak. So all the artists who really wanted to do a fairy tale, there hadn't been a fairy tale in 30 years. So it was an inspiration to try and do one that wasn't exactly like those other ones, and yet could kind of sit on the shelf with those. So because we wanted to reflect our own sensibilities, our own sense of humor and entertainment and all that. So we did. So it took us 3 years to make it. And they were yelling at us the whole time about spending too much money and this and that, even though it was done relatively cheaply. And then we had no idea if other people would like it. We knew we liked it, and we loved the music. And then we previewed it for a public audience for the first time a few months before it came out. And the preview went amazingly well, and the numbers were huge and all that. And Jeffrey Katzenberg got dollar signs in his eyes because he realized, hey, wait a minute, I I could market this to a bigger audience. It's not just for kids. Adults can enjoy this and teenagers. And so they developed multiple ad campaigns then. We had tried to sell them earlier on doing a poster for it that featured like the mermaid on a rock, a la Copenhagen and all that. And they said, no, that's too, they wanted a poster that was just happy-go-lucky with all the characters. But then once we had this preview, Jeffrey realized adults might like it as well. So they, one day at our sound mix, one of Howard's assistants came down the aisle, look at the new poster they put out. And it was a silhouetted mermaid on a rock, just what we tried to sell Jeffrey on earlier that he had refused. So they did the dual ad campaign. So they're advertising both to adults and to kids. And that's the way it played. It played to both audiences and was really well received around the world. And it was, we were very relieved when it came out because it was such a difficult movie to make, but inspired always by Hans Christian Andersen himself and by the music of Howard. And then all these young artists getting a chance to show what they could do. They had been kind of suppressed on some of the earlier movies, and we're like, no, go for it. And so it was really fun to give them their chance to display what they could do, like Glenn Keane and Mark Hand, people like that. And yeah, it was fun.
And how were the characters designed? Because they're so memorable, famous. And how did you decide, for example, the mermaid to have red hair, for example?
Well, Ron, you wouldn't know to look at him now because he's very gray, but he had red hair back in the day. He had very bright red hair. And I think it was his call to make her redhead because he had red hair and because it fit her personality and because it made her different than any of the other Disney heroines. We didn't want to do another blonde and we didn't want to do another brunette. And just she was kind of fiery and she had this conflict with her father. And we even felt that her father, before his hair went gray, it was probably red actually, and it had gone gray over the years. But we wanted a redheaded mermaid, but we had to fight Jeffrey Katzenberg on that because he didn't realize that we were going to do a red-haired mermaid, our boss. And finally, he saw some shots in color where she had red hair. And he's like, "What is this?" He's like, "She's supposed to be blonde." He said, "Don't you know all mermaids are blonde?" And I think he learned that from Splash. But he said, "Jeffrey, all mermaids don't have to be blonde." And he like grudgingly, okay, all right. So the funny thing was because he still was concerned about it when they made the dolls after the movie came out, he still was worried about her having red hair. So he gave the dolls kind of a strawberry blonde. The first dolls had kind of blondish reddish hair because the word on the street was red haired dolls don't sell. And so all these girls are like, this doesn't look like the movie. And so they had to redo the dolls with red hair. And then suddenly they couldn't keep them in the stores. They were flying off the shelves. In fact, even the earliest, the walk around character at Disneyland, because Jeffrey was approving it, he gave her kind of blondish reddish hair. And we're like, Jeffrey, that's not them. So they fixed that later too. But we were happy to have a red-haired mermaid. And we think it really made her distinctive. And of course, that hair color would pop against the blue of the water and everything. So you had that kind of a warm, cool contrast. So yes, we're happy we had a mermaid. We did fight also, the witch. Originally, there were a lot of different ideas on the witch. She was at one point going to be a lionfish or a scorpionfish who would shoot out these little spines from her. But that was too complicated to draw. And one of our artists, Matt O'Callahan, came up with the idea, well, what if she was half octopus? And we liked that idea. And he did some drawings like that. And Rob Minkoff, who did the original animation, who later directed Lion King, he did this cool drawing of her that Howard Ashman really liked because he said, oh, her top half, she was very campy and vampy. And he said, oh, she looks like a Miami Beach matron. And he liked that. So we combined this sort of Miami Beach matron with this octopus and a little bit of Divine, this cross-dressing guy that Howard knew from Baltimore, who had made movies with John Waters, Pink Flamingos and Female Trouble and all these movies. We had an earlier version that was sort of based more on Divine, and we showed it to Jeffrey Katzenberg, and he was horrified because she had a mohawk and very extreme and like tattoos practically. And he said, guys, this is too much. This is way too much. So we had to pull back, and which was not a bad idea. So we wound up with the kind of combination that we got. But yeah, we were very happy with it. And the woman who did the voice in America, Pat Carroll, she just died the last year or so in her 90s. She was a lot of fun to work with and did an amazing job on the song. When Howard Ashman would write these songs, he would do demos of the songs himself because he was an actor as well as a writer. So he did the Witch's song, and all that sort of, silkiness and the comedy in the song, he performed in his demo. So when the actors are doing it, they're inspired by hearing Howard's demo, and then they've got to live up to Howard's version, because Howard often said he did Under the Sea too, and he did a very funny version of that. And so Sam Wright, who was the American voice, was inspired by what Howard did on that. So yeah, so the music was really a central part of Mermaid. We really tried to make the songs advance the story so that you couldn't cut the song out and still tell the same story. We feel like music works best when it's so integrated into the story that it can't be lifted out, because then it becomes just kind of a stop. You stop the story, you do a number, and then you resume the story. But we wanted the story to have advanced from the beginning of the song to the end, which we feel like we did. So I think it's part of the reason why, and just the infectiousness of Alan's melodies and the cleverness of Howard's lyrics. We didn't know when we made the movie, would anybody else like this other than us? And because we had made some movies where, we a month after it came out, we'd say to someone, "Oh, I worked on this movie or that," and they'd say, "When's that coming out?" We said, "It already came out." So with Mermaid, we didn't have that problem. Everybody seemed to know about it, and it really reached a wide audience. And then it was reissued, and then they decided to put it on video years later, and that widened the audience further. And we got to go to Cannes we went to the Cannes Film Festival. It was shown out of competition there, and they had a giant inflated mermaid in the harbor by the Croisette there. So the Warner Brothers publicity person, this woman, Warner was also doing the Disney publicity at that time for Europe. As we drove in, she said, "All of Cannes is waiting for the Little Mermaid." And we were like, "Really?" And we rounded the corner, and there was this giant mermaid in the harbor, with her arm extended. And the weird thing was, of course, by the end of the festival, she had sprung a leak. So the statue arm, she was practically in the water. It wasn't so good, but it was a lot of fun going to the festival and showing it there. And they had walk around characters, and we went down the Croisette. And it was a far cry, as I say, from some of the earlier movies where we would do them and no one would hear about them. When we did like Mermaid and we did Aladdin, the publicity department was so great at getting the word out around the world so that it really became kind of a phenomenon, everywhere. So that was great.
So I also want to hear something about Aladdin. Also, it's a childhood favorite.
Okay.
These two movies are really watched a lot of times.
Oh, really? Yeah. Yeah. Aladdin, Howard Ashman had originally developed a version of Aladdin that he was possibly going to direct, but as an animated film. And he wrote a treatment and he wrote some songs on it. And they were trying to develop a script from it. And this was while we were working on Mermaid. He was off doing that after he had finished his work on Mermaid. But the studio wasn't liking the scripts they were getting based on Howard's treatment. So they abandoned Howard's treatment and they started developing other treatments. And so when we got done with Aladdin, we were presented with, when we got done with Little Mermaid, rather, we had a choice of three things they suggested to us that they would like us to work on for our next film. One was this thing with lions in Africa called King of the Jungle. And we thought, who's going to go see a movie like that? So we said, no, forget that one. I think that one wound up turning out pretty good though. And then they suggested we do a version of Swan Lake. There was a version they were kicking around of that. But we felt like that was too much like Little Mermaid. And so the third project that they had in their development thing was Aladdin, which Howard had suggested. We really liked that. We liked the whole Arabian Nights thing and genies and lamps and flying carpets and all that. So we said yes to that. So then we resurrected Howard's old version, and we added some new characters. There were too many human characters in the script that they had been developing at the studio outside of Howard's. And so in that version, Jasmine had a handmaiden, and we said, well, let's cut the handmaiden, but what if we give her a tiger as a pet that shows how powerful she is, that she could kind of control this big tiger like a little cat. And Aladdin, we gave him a monkey, because we thought he's a street performer, or con man on the streets, would be fun to have this little monkey on his shoulder. And we gave, and actually in Howard's treatment, he had a parrot with Jafar, and we liked that idea. They had gone away from that, but we thought that was funny. And Howard had the idea sort of that, the parrot was actually very talkative in private and then just acted like a parrot out in public. So we went with that idea. So we wrote the script for Aladdin. So we said to them, yes, we'd like to do Aladdin. We developed our own script. Ron and I wrote it. We envisioned Robin Williams as our genie. We didn't know if he would do it, but we wrote the script as if he was going to do it. with him doing all these quick changes and all that. And then they approached, it was actually Eric Goldberg, the great animator who animated the genie, took a comedy album that Robin Williams had done and did some animation to the comedy album and showed that to Jeffrey Katzenberg to sell him on the idea of Robin doing the voice, because Jeffrey, it seemed like, had been picturing that the genie should just be this imposing, powerful guy, and Robin Williams being this powerful genie, he couldn't quite imagine, it seemed like. So we did that to sell him on. He got sold on it. He brought Robin in. Robin was working on Hook at the time, I think, or Toys. I can't remember which one, but one of these other movies. Came in with his wife, looked at the storyboards and really loved it, said, yes, I'd like to do the movie. So then we proceeded to record with Robin in between his live action filmings. And in fact, even he was rehearsing the song that he was going to perform while during the day he was working on Hook, and he was suspended in a harness, against a green screen, and he was exhausted, and it would be 10 o'clock at night. And we would come to his house that he was staying at in Beverly Hills, and the music director would be plunking it out on the piano, and Robin would spend an hour rehearsing the song at 10 at night after a full day of shooting, and it was very exhausting, but he was absolutely great to work with. And of course he improvised a great deal. He performed it as written, and as Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio, who also joined us as writers, as they had written, but then we encouraged him to improvise, and certainly he went to town. And we would then, Eric Goldberg and Ron and myself would take everything he recorded, was all transcribed, and we would construct a new scene out of his ad libs and invent new lines that would make the ad libs work and all that, and create a new scene and kind of stitch it back together again. So the scene that started out this long, had become this long, and we brought it back down to this length, but using these choice Robin bits that each of us had liked. And so that's how it got reconstructed. And it was a blast to animate too, because we could do things that live action couldn't do with Robin. You couldn't change the way he looked, and we could do it in the blink of an eye. And it really, in some ways, becomes the most Robin Williams movie of any of them, of any of his long catalog of great films. I mean, it was able to take advantage of his comedic volatility. So it was fun, but it was a challenge. And we were influenced by the artist Al Hirschfeld, the great caricaturist, who Eric Goldberg was a big fan of. And so we kind of styled the movie a little bit like Al Hirschfeld, because he has a very calligraphic line, and we had looked at Persian miniatures and the great Persian calligraphy. And so we wanted to get a feeling of the Persian calligraphy into the backgrounds and into the characters, a very sort of, serpentine, elegant calligraph. So all the characters really, Eric, helped bring them into that world of Hirschfeld and of this cursive kind of rounded line effect, not angular at all. So it was a challenge, and it was fun. And we knew we were taking a risk because we broke the fourth wall. We had the genie talking to the audience sometimes and doing, topical. And it was a risky thing for a Disney feature to go outside the box as far as we went on that one. But we thought, if we still have some real emotion in the movie between the genie and Aladdin, their friendship, and real emotion in the love story, and a real threat from the villain, despite how campy he can be at times, it could still work, and it could still stand the test of time. And I'm happy that people are still watching the movie, and it has spawned these other generations. They did a play on Broadway, they've done these live action films, because the characters kind of resonated. And it's still a movie in many ways about wish fulfillment. And wouldn't I like to fly on a carpet around the world? And wouldn't I like to find a cave full of treasure? And wouldn't I like to, if you're a guy, wouldn't I like to woo a beautiful princess? And if you're a girl, wouldn't I like to ride a carpet with a handsome dude? I mean, it sort of taps into those basic things. And yet the Aladdin genie story was the heart of it in many ways, their friendship, and him promising to free the genie, and then getting lost along the way and going back on his promise, and then coming through at the end and coming to realize that you don't have to be dressed up in a fancy outfit to be a good person. You really, the clothes don't make the man. So it was a fun movie to do.
And what were some challenges when making the film?
Well, the biggest challenge was that there were a couple. One was that as we were just getting going on it, the Gulf War erupted in the Middle East. And originally the movie was set in Baghdad. And Roy Disney, our boss, said, you cannot do a movie set in Baghdad, given the world events that are going on right now. So I went and took the letters from Baghdad, and I made an anagram and turned it into Agrabah, which is a thing I made up. It's sort of an anagram, but it's not Baghdad anymore. And Jeffrey Katzmer, to his credit, even though there was trouble in the Middle East, he said, "We're still forging ahead. We're going to make this movie, and it's okay," because he could have bailed on the whole movie. So it's credit to Jeffrey for doing that. But the other big challenge was, we worked on the script, we storyboarded it, we put the whole movie up on what we call story reels, where we took all our storyboard drawings and did very rough soundtrack to it, had a 90-minute version of the movie that had no animation in it, showed it to Jeffrey Katzenberg, and we were about a year and a half out from the movie coming out, and when we showed it to him, and he hated what we showed him. He had some vague ideas of what he was thinking he was going to see, because he liked some other movies in that milieu, and he just didn't get it. And so he was like, "Start over." I'm like, "Start over? What are you talking about?" And so we did get new writers at that point. We got Ted Elliott, Terry Rossio, who later went on to write the Pirates of the Caribbean. Wonderful writers. They came up with some new ideas, and we came up with some new ideas, and we restructured the movie. Aladdin used to have a mother in the earlier version, and part of his goal was to make good for his mother, because he was always goofing things up. And there's a beautiful song had written called "Proud of Your Boy." Proud of your boy, I make you proud of your boy, that he sang to his mother. Well, Jeffrey didn't like the mother. The mom's a zero. Get rid of the mom. So we got rid of the mom. Of course, my mother later, "Why do you not have mothers in these movies? What is it? What did I do to you that you always?" I'm like, Mom, the fairy tales, they don't have mothers. But what was it between? No, it wasn't us. It's okay. So we rewrote the movie with Ted and Terry, and Mom went away, and that song had to go away, and Aladdin became an orphan, and so we had to make all sorts of adjustments. But fortunately, we got it together, and it works. So the final movie that you see, about a third of that movie is still what was there originally. We still preserved a third of it. About a third of it is a rework of what we had originally, and then a third of it is kind of completely new. But we managed to get it done, for 92. So it was neck, and we were really working like crazy to get it done. And it took 3 years to make the movie, which Mermaid took 3 years. This took 3 years, but it was but a year and a half out. They were like, "Start over." So that was a crazy schedule. So that was, I would say, one of the biggest challenges, just trying to get a story that Jeffrey liked and that we thought worked, and get it done on time.
And what were some stories that you would have wanted to make as feature films when working at Disney?
Well, there was one that we wanted to do later on that we couldn't. We had trouble getting the rights to, and it's an interesting story, but it's based on a book by Terry Pratchett. I don't know if you know Terry Pratchett, but he wrote the Discworld series. He's a British author. He died a few years ago, but he wrote this book called Mort, which is set in his medieval fantasy world that he created, and it's a comedy, and it's about a hapless kid who wants to apprentice to somebody in this world, and no one will have him because he's kind of, is a bumbler, and he winds up, the only job he can get is an apprentice to the Grim Reaper, who rides on his horse and has the scythe and all that. So it's actually a very life-affirming story and a very funny story. But there were rights problems, and we couldn't get the rights because Terry Pratchett had sold some of the rights to a third party, and they couldn't make a deal. So that was one that we didn't get to do. We've pitched other ones along the way. We had a Norse mythology movie that we didn't get to do that might have been fun, but that was before they had made any of these Thor movies, and everything. Now, Norse mythology has many movies in its area, but we were pitching one a long time ago that didn't quite go. We had pitched them doing a version, and finally they're doing it, of Roald Dahl's book, The Twits, which is a very funny book about this couple that does crimes, enlists animals to do crimes for them. And this couple is a horrible married couple that are very mean to each other. They're finally making, I think it's either a feature, I think Netflix is doing it finally, and I think Taika Waititi might be involved. And I don't know if it's live action or animation. I think it's animation, but that's a cool story. So there have been these projects along the way that we hope to realize it didn't happen, and there are other fairy tales out there, I think, that I won't mention, but that seem like they could be interesting. So, but we generally got to, it was our idea to do Little Mermaid. It was our idea to do Moana, and it was our idea to do Treasure Planet. So those three movies were generated by us. The others were ones that were in development, but that we really liked: Aladdin, Hercules, Princess and the Frog. It was called The Frog Princess at that point, but those were all ideas that had had some development put into them. But I do think, obviously, fairy tales, animated features don't just have to be fairy tales, but fairy tales I like. It's just the primal aspect of fairy tales and how you can invent a world, and there's an arc to them. I'm not crazy about the sequels to fairy tales generally, because I feel like a fairy tale has its own arc, and it doesn't, to me, lend itself to a sequel the way, say, like The Incredibles. Yeah, that seems, yeah, they go and have another adventure. That seems fine, or things like that. But never been fond of taking a fairy tale and doing another one after it.
And how do you delegate responsibilities with the co-director? How do
Well, because we co-wrote together, we had ironed a lot of our creative issues out when we wrote the script. Usually, and in fact, even the way we write the script, we're a little bit like left and right hands on the piano, in that Ron is really good at structure. He's great at structure and editing, and he's funny too. But then I'm more sort of would invent, improvise, and create comic business and things like that. So basically, we would construct an outline of the story together, and then I would go off and write ahead of Ron, and I would improvise on paper. I would take the scenes from the movie, the opening scene 10 different ways, and I would give it to Ron, and I would just keep going, and I would write, every scene, multiple variations and options and things. And then Ron would take those and he would read them. And if he'd circle the ones he liked and he'd work those in. And if sometimes he wouldn't like any of the things I wrote, and he'd write a completely new scene. And so, but he said, I don't want you to read what I'm writing because it's going to slow me down until we have the whole script done. So basically, I'd feed him stuff. And unless he was doing something that changed the storyline, I would not read what he had assembled and written until, whatever, 8 or 10 weeks later. Then he would hand me the first rough draft of the script. And of course, I had written so many versions of it that I couldn't even keep track of that. I would read the script and I'd say, why didn't you use my part on this scene? And he said, that is your part. You wrote that one. I said, oh, I did. And I went back, oh yeah, I wrote that. So anyway, so we did that. So we had hashed out a lot of things before we got to the directing part, but then we worked together very collaboratively on most of the directorial assignments. And we had grown up in a system that had multiple directors. Disney, when Disney was making Snow White and Pinocchio, they had multiple directors, although they had a very strong producer, Walt Disney, who really put a stamp on it. We really, as directors, wanted to be in that role of, controlling the creative thing. But there was enough work that having two directors was helpful. So we divided the movie into sequences, and he directed some sequences and I directed other sequences. But we always showed each other what we were working on. We got together in the editing bay as the footage came in to review the footage together to give notes on what worked and what didn't work. We were always there for all the recording sessions. We were always picked the takes that we were going to use together. And so we were and we looked at the character designs together and the color footage. So it was very much a collaborative enterprise. But by doing it where we divided up into sequences, we also got our sort of little kingdoms, as it were, so we would work with a team of animators on that sequence. Ron would work with some on that. I'd work with others on another one. So we were able to put our own stamp on it while still keeping it all unified. So it was great. But we were very simpatico. We were the same age. We were both from the Midwest of the US. We were both born Catholic. He went another direction into La La Land somewhere, but I remained a Catholic. But we liked the same movies, and we liked the same Disney films, and we had the same sort of sense of humor. And we're both kind of comic guys, and yet we want heart and emotion in these stories as well. It's paramount that you get that in it. So we made a good team, and that we saw things enough alike, and yet we were different enough so that we sort of complement each other. We weren't, he brought things to the party that I couldn't, and I brought some things that he couldn't. So it was a happy marriage. Although we were certainly, by the end of our careers, we were a bickering married couple, where we would sit there and argue a lot, not in any heated way generally, but we would, it's like you'd get, somebody's habits after 40 years. Why? Too much. We both accused the other of interrupting the person all the time. We had these tiffs. But anyway, he was a great collaborator, great partner, brilliant guy. I'm very lucky and happy to have worked with him. And the movies wouldn't be the same without him, but they wouldn't be the same without me either. So we're both happy with the way they emerged.
And you both met at when working at Disney, yes?
Yeah, he came there in that training program, but he, even though we're the same age, he got to Disney a few years before me because he didn't go to college. He went straight from high school into the industry where he worked for a TV station back in Iowa. And then he came out, he worked at Hanna-Barbera for a while because he couldn't get into Disney. And then he got into Disney. So by the time I got into Disney, he was already established as an animator. He had worked on Pete's Dragon and The Rescuers and The Fox and the Hound, and was a really good animator. And so, but ironically, the more he animated, the less he liked animation. He really liked story. He liked writing. He liked that better than he liked animating. So he sort of left animation while I was doing animation, but then I segued into story. So yeah, so I just sort of got to know him on The Fox and the Hound, where he was animating and I was animating, and just learned. He was a funny guy and he was very smart. And then we really worked together for the first time on The Great Mouse Detective, where he had pitched that idea actually to the studio based on a book that Eve Titus had written, Basil of Baker Street, said this would make a fun feature, and they put it in development. They liked it, and then so originally they assigned me to direct that movie, and then Ron came on after I did. So Ron and I paired up on that movie. We both directed on it. We both wrote on it, and that was where we worked together. And we also worked together on The Black Cauldron for 6 months to a year, but the directors on that movie didn't like our ideas. So Ron and I bonded over the fact that we couldn't get any of our ideas through to the other directors. I was a director on that film, but I never got to direct anything because they shot down all my ideas. I had wanted to use some Tim Burton designs for the movie. They didn't like that. They didn't like the story ideas that really were, let's use more of the book and less of this other stuff. They didn't like that. So Ron and I were both sort of banished from The Black Cauldron, and we moved on to Basil of Baker Street. So those two films were the ones where we really kind of bonded and collaborated initially.
And what was it like to work on your last hand-painted feature film, The Princess and the Frog?
That was fun because we got to, the studio had moved away from hand-drawn animation, and really that was Pixar, Disney buying Pixar and then putting John Lasseter in charge. John Lasseter, my old college classmate, who loved hand-drawn animation, and he really wanted to continue doing hand-drawn. So he gave us the option on Princess and the Frog. He actually suggested, Disney had been developing a version of a book called The Frog Princess, where the princess got turned into a frog rather than the prince. And in the meantime, Pixar had been developing a version based on an idea that Ralph Eggleston, the art director, had New Orleans, of setting a frog prince in New Orleans. And so they were developing that a bit. And then they were developing, and the studio was developing one based on the Frog Princess. And so when John Lasseter came in from Pixar, he said to us, because we had been banished from Disney actually for about 6 months because we couldn't get a project off the ground, he brought us back into Disney and said, why don't you look at this Frog Prince idea? I think you guys could come up with a good angle on that. So we looked at both versions, and we said, yeah, we like the New Orleans setting, but we think the heroine could be African-American, and she could be the one that's turned into this frog, and we could use elements of voodoo as the magic in this, and all this. And John loved our pitch, and he sent us down to New Orleans because neither Ron nor myself had been to New Orleans. So we went there, and we got to go to the bayou, and we met with a voodoo priestess, and we went and heard jazz in the French Quarter and all these things, and it was great. So we incorporated those into the script when we wrote the script, and we brought on Rob Edwards, who was an African-American writer. We wrote the first pass of the script, but we really did feel like we were tone deaf to certain things. So Rob came in and really helped us out, and was our co-writer on the script. But we got to work with animators again, like Eric Goldberg, and who had done the Genie, and Mark Henn, who had done Jasmine and all that. He did Tiana on this. And for the villain, we got Bruce Smith, this great animator who had worked on Tarzan, and we had never worked with him before, but he's an unbelievable draftsman and animator. And again, we hired a choreographer, this girl I used to work with at the studio, Betsy, who we shot reference footage that had 20s eccentric dance things worked in for Dr. Facilier. But it was certainly a challenge to make the movie because we were trying to be more aware of, we're trying to make a movie that would be sensitive to certain racial issues, and it was tricky to navigate certain things. But we really liked the idea of having this African-American heroine in the movie, and that she was not a traditional princess. She worked in a, she was a waitress who wanted to own her own restaurant. She had this dream, this kind of real world dream that was novel for Disney. That had never been done before. And so, and we were inspired by Leah Chase, this great African American restaurateur in New Orleans in the French Quarter, who had this restaurant, the Dookie Chase restaurant, and she made it this landmark there that hosted presidents and kings and regular people, and it had great Creole cooking there. So we sort of were inspired by Leah when we were doing the film.
So I think it is also a very beautiful film, and I myself would like to see more movies like that again.
Yeah, we really loved, and John Lasseter loved it, and the preview audiences loved it too. It was really well previewed and all that. But still, there's this ongoing thing with CG. The CG films were doing better than the hand-drawn ones were, and so the studio, at a certain point, just committed completely to making CG films, which we were disappointed about. And I hope someday they reconsider that. They've done, some little short projects, and even on Moana, we had the tattoos on Maui. Art Goldberg animated those. Those were done hand-drawn and were mapped on. I still think, that a well-done hand animated feature could do well at the box office if the story is strong and the characters are good. And so I'm hoping whoever, it may not come from Disney initially, but wherever it comes from, I hope that art form stays alive, because it's, and again, in jeopardy almost when we started, when all these animators were in their 60s. Now, Art Goldberg is in his 60s, and some of these animators who did those things. And there are some great young animators who come along, but they need a venue, they need a project to demonstrate what they can do. So I hope that hand-drawn continues. But I love the CG. I don't think it's one over the other. They do different things, and stop motion as well. Guillermo del Toro's film, but Tim's film and Henry's film, Coraline and all that were fabulous. And I like seeing the art form go different directions. And the Spider-Verse movies, I think, have been great in terms of stretching the boundaries and blurring them. What is animation? Using all these graphic elements to tell a story that take advantage of the fact that it is, it isn't live action. And I think those, have been pretty fantastic. So that's exciting.
And what advice would you give to young filmmakers who are starting out in the industry?
Well, I still think drawing is an important skill to have, even if you're working in CG. So I would encourage most artists to develop their drawing skills as a way of communicating their ideas. If they have ideas, even if you're working in CG or stop motion, I think drawing is a great skill to have. Then I would say take advantage of your time you have in school. There's many resources now that we didn't have. There's many books on animation that you can look at. There are, when I started, young lady, Diana, I'll tell you, there wasn't even VHS when I started. So I actually had gotten Super 8 films of some of the early, they did little like 10-minute cut downs of Snow White and Pinocchio on Super 8. The film was that wide. And so I had a little viewer. So I was looking at those, studying the animation on those. But now with DVDs, with online, with these programs, you can make your own film. You can study animation in ways you never could before. You have these books, you have these podcasts, you have just a million ways you can learn about animation and try and develop your own skills. Even if you don't go to an expensive animation school, you can kind of, with these other things, I think there's a way you can kind of learn them yourself. But you've got to do it. I mean, you can't think about it. You improve by working hard and by showing your work to other people and getting criticism. I mean, that's what you have to learn, is to accept, to be vulnerable and put yourself out there and be willing to hear criticism, which isn't always fun, and you have to get over being defensive. You may be defensive initially, but try and reflect, do these people have a point? Because if you are working in some kind of animation field that involves showing a film to an audience and you need them to understand it, then that's part of the job, really, in a way, is to learn what you have in your head and what people get out of what you're doing are not necessarily the same thing. And then you have to learn there's two different things there too. Is it the idea that's problematic because you've contradicted yourself somewhere, or you're not, or is it just your communication of the idea? Is it that we're confusing, or is there no, the idea is somehow bad? And so you have to learn through the course of things, what is it? Is it that the inherent flaw in it, or no, it's a good idea, you're just not communicating it properly. So developing that kind of thick skin and being willing to show your work and and rework. A lot of animation is iteration and reiteration. Writing is that way. Animating can be that way. Storyboarding certainly can be that way. You have to be willing to kind of jump back in on the same material and look at its flaws and try and make it better. So I would encourage young people to do those things. You know, to really show your work hard, carry a sketchbook. If you have to get over the thing of drawing in public. I had that too. When I first drew in public, I was afraid there were people looking, and nobody cares what you're doing. So you can draw, and just you're in your little world drawing, but capturing life on the fly is a great thing for your powers of observation, because really all animation is based on your observation of the world and the people around you. And the more you can communicate that and see those details, what makes this person, you know, they walk away that's different than other people. When they express joy, they do it differently than other people do it. A child has 10 different ways they can express happiness. What are some of those variations? And start to absorb those things. And then your synthesis of all these things that come in, you know, you will use elements that you've seen from these films and from other people, but hopefully with the way it all gets mixed up in the gumbo of who you are, it comes out uniquely. You know, it has elements of other things, but you're presenting your vision of the world, and you've developed your voice and your point of view. Obviously, if you're working in a big studio system, you're showing it to people and you have to sell them on your voice, but it's important to get a sense of what is it that you respond to emotionally, creatively, that you want to share or comment on with the world or give some insight to. And it's a great medium. You know, animation combines so many different disciplines. You know, it can involve drawing, it can involve sculpture, it can involve painting, it can involve dance, it can involve filmmaking, cutting, staging, dramaturgy, and physics and science and the real world and effects and you know, real principles of inertia and things like that. It's just and Eric Larson years ago, he had said, my mentor said, our only limit in animation is our ability to imagine and to draw what we can imagine. Now, I would update that given the new tools. Our only limit is our ability to imagine and then to communicate those ideas by whatever means you have. And there are many aside from drawing now. So that is a very broad canvas, and that's kind of inspiring in itself to take advantage of that freedom and communicate some idea that makes the world a better place in some way.